Workshop unveiled the new White Dwarf miniature in preparation for the colossal 500th issue of the magazine. I thought this was therefore the ideal opportunity on the approach of his birthday to dive into the background lore of that most famous of white-bearded stunties, the White Dwarf himself. So, buckle in and let's get started. White Dwarf magazine then, as I say, it's coming up on issue 500. It's had a somewhat rocky history. There's been some strange moments. In particular, I'm looking at you, White Dwarf Weekly, and Warhammer Visions. I don't propose to do a history of the magazine itself at this point, purely the character. But I want to just briefly reflect upon what could have been, given that when they started Games Workshop, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson initially called their magazine Owl and Weasel. So right now we could be looking at the celebration of the 500th issue of Owl and Weasel, presumably with a very different background to the Warhammer world, with owls and weasels everywhere. Incidentally, the reason why they have said that they named the magazine as such was that you needed the intelligence of an owl but the cunning of a weasel to play war games. As it is, thankfully and luckily for everyone, instead they decided to rebrand their magazine White Dwarf, and right there on the very first issue, issue 1, stuck up in the top corner was a little icon representing our noble hero, the White Dwarf. He appeared in every single issue of White Dwarf in some way, shape or form for a number of years, getting a redesign shortly before his 100th issue, when he was rebranded from being a kind of somewhat stocky casual axe-holding black and white image to the more classic, colorized 80s version that we had, and then again, in my personal favourite incarnation, he got rebranded in the approach to his 200th issue. I think around about issue 190 or 191, he got his gurning image appearing in the top corner of the new Fat Dwarf, as it was known. He did not, however, have a name up until his 200th issue. So issue 100, there's almost nothing about him. Aside from him being stuck slap bang there in the middle of the cover, there is very little about him. He had a miniature prior to this point. One of the earliest miniatures that was produced by Games Workshop was the White Dwarf, and it was simply modelled as White Dwarf. That's what it said on his little sort of stand. I had the privilege of holding one last year as I gave it away as a prize in one of my events. But he did not have a name until issue 200, when it was decided that not only should he have a model, but he should have rules as well. And this was designed by the venerable Nigel Stillman, who gave us that venerable title, Grombrindal, for the White Dwarf. And finally, we got some background information about him. So here's what we know as it was established in issue 200. The White Dwarf is a figure of legend, a bearded stranger who might arrive in the camp of an army of dwarves at the moment when all hope seems lost, on the eve before a battle as they prepare to sell their souls, to sell their lives dearly. Then, gathered around the campfires with them, cloaked in a simple hooded robe, he might share a keg of ale and listen to their stories, before, the next morning, casting off his hood to reveal his glittering, splendid panoply, and lay waste to their foes. The background also suggested at this point, this was the first time that this was hinted, that not only was he, this almost living legend, this Hercules travelling around the dwarven realms, walking the high roads, through the mountains, slaying monsters and assisting dwarves in trouble and upholding the dwarven way, but in fact he might be the reincarnation or the reborn form of the first and greatest of the dwarf kings, Snorri Whitebeard, appropriate name given, the long white beard. The background, as we got it laid out for us, is that on his deathbed, the dwarven king said to his greatest and dearest friend, Malekith, the ambassador of the High Elves in his days before his turn to the corrupted Witch King that we would later know him to be, he made a solemn pledge. Let it be known to our allies and our enemies that the death is not the end of my guardianship. Vengeance shall be mine when our foes are great. I shall return to my people. When the foul creatures of this world bay at the doors to Karaz-a-Karak, I shall take up my axe once more, and my ire shall rock the mountains. Heed my words, Malekith of Ulthuan, and heed them well. Great have been our deeds, and great is the legacy that I leave to you, my closest confidant, my finest comrade in arms. Swear to me now, as my dying breath fills my lungs, that my oath has been heard. Swear to it, on my own grave, on my spirit, that you shall remain true to the ideals we have both striven for these many years. And know this, that there is nothing so foul as an oath breaker. And thus, accompanied only by Malekith, which is somewhat worrying given what we know about Malekith later. I do kind of worry that Malekith was there with like a pillow over his face. But so died Snorri Whitebeard and was entombed within that greatest of dwarven cities, Karaz-a-Karak, in a mighty vault laden with the strongest runes and curses that the runesmiths of the day could craft, a vengeance against all who would turn their ire upon the dwarves. The first appearance of the White Dwarf, then, is during the War of Vengeance, or the War of the Beard, as it's sometimes colloquially known. I've covered this briefly in my previous lore video about High Elves, but essentially, Malekith broke his oath, he broke faith with his friend when some of his dark kin at least, attacked a dwarven convoy of merchantmen, and thus a dwarven ambassador was dispatched to Ulthuan to demand recompense, and the Caledor II, the somewhat foolish and cruel king of the High Elves at the day, rather than listen to the entreaties of the dwarven ambassador, sent him back to Karaz-a-Karak with the greatest shame a dwarf could endure, his beard shorn off. And thus the war between the elves and the dwarves began. For 400 years it raged, but at the first siege of Tor Elisor, when the dwarves attacked and laid siege to that capital of the old world colonies of the elves, then a hooded ancestor appeared amongst the dwarven host, having appeared immediately after Malekith had broken his oath. Thus the White Dwarf appeared and laid waste to a host of elves. 8 dragons he slew that day. The link, therefore, is strong to suggest that he is indeed Snorri Whitebeard, and it's perhaps borne out by some of the lore about Snorri Whitebeard, when you learn more about him. So this obviously wasn't established at the point when the 4th edition Dwarf book was published, and we kind of first got introduced to the idea of the first king of the dwarves. But what is known now is that Snorri Whitebeard was essentially a dwarven demigod. I mean, frankly, he ought to have been a deity to begin with. He was the direct son of the dwarven ancestor gods Grungi and Valaya. Those two dwarven, deities, Valaya, the goddess of hearth and home, Grungi, the smith god, gave birth to a sole king before leaving the mortal world for the realms of the gods. And he became the first king of the dwarves. If he wasn't a demigod, at the very least, he had to have been the greatest dwarf that ever lived. And it's little surprise, therefore, that perhaps he is associated with the White Dwarf. Certainly there are strong links between the White Dwarf as well in the war gear that he bears. So this, again, was set out by Nigel Stillman in the rules that were published in issue 200, this so that you could use your White Dwarf model that was released at that time in your games of Warhammer. The White Dwarf is equipped with the Rune Helm of Zufbar. This is an awesome helmet that has been identified as the lost helm of Zufbar that was taken when the Greenskins took the hold, but has presumably been reclaimed by the White Dwarf since then. He also bore Glimril scale armour. Again, this is perhaps a reference to Snorri Whitebeard. What we know is that Malekith gifted his greatest friend, Snorri, a entire bushel load of the finest mithril that had ever been mined in Ulthuan. One of the only times it's ever been gifted to anyone outside of Ulthuan. And it was said that it was then smelted with Grombrindal to create a new and even more potent ore. What we do know is that after the Battle of Thrag, and that's a great name, the White Dwarf slew 10,000 Chaos Warriors and clutched in the teeth of the Chaos Lord's body at the end of the battle was a single scale of a material that the runesmiths had never encountered before. They called it Glimril, suggesting perhaps that merger of Grombrindal and Mithril, and suggesting that it had perhaps been forged by the ancestor gods and Grungi himself. Also, the White Dwarf is seen wearing the rune cloak of Valaya, a beautiful kind of long reddish-purple cloak, purple being the colour of Valaya. I am slightly concerned, given that it was later established that that Snorri, at least, is supposed to be the son of Grungni and Valaya. The background that Nigel Stillman wrote for the White Dwarf suggested that the goddess Valaya fell in love with the White Dwarf and gifted him this cloak. But perhaps it was a mother's love. Who can tell? In any event, this noble flowing cloak has been seen on pretty much every model of the White Dwarf since then. And finally, the rune axe of Grimnir. What more potent weapon could you have than the axe of the Slayer God himself? These are the equipment that the White Dwarf has wielded in pretty much every incarnation, rules-wise at least, since then. He got refreshed rules in issue 300, which was a stonker of a bumper issue, and there was some more information laid out by Gav Thorpe at that point, detailing the many battles that the White Dwarf had been involved in. Since then, the White Dwarf has had a host of models. So there was the original White Dwarf model that was released way back when the magazine was relatively new. There was the White Dwarf model with an axe brandished two-handed that was released for issue 200. A new White Dwarf model was issued for issue 300, and further White Dwarf models have then been released in kind of a flood since then. There was a White Dwarf model that was released, which is the White Dwarf held aloft on a shield by two great dwarven heroes, Gotrek Gurnason and Joseph Bugman, which also, again, had rules. It was a complete mad model to use. There have been a host of White Dwarf models that were released as essentially annual special subscription miniatures. If you had a subscription to White Dwarf, then you got the crazy White Dwarf miniature for the year, which might be the White Dwarf in space, or the White Dwarf in power armour, or the White Dwarf as a pirate, which is by far one of my favourites, incidentally. The White Dwarf has since made a transition recently into the Age of Sigmar. We have had, for a while now, the classic plastic Troll Slayer model that was then kind of marketed as a dispossessed model, was repainted with white hair and beard, and was essentially suggested to be perhaps a Slayer version or a dispossessed version of the White Dwarf, and he got rules relatively early on in Age of Sigmar. We are now expecting rules for the White Dwarf in Age of Sigmar, Warcry, Warhammer Underworlds, I think. I think basically everything, bizarrely, except for the Old World, is supposedly going to get rules for the White Dwarf for this new model that's coming out. I saw that new model and immediately thought, well, that's going on a square base. I'll either use the issue 200 rules, the issue 300 rules, or maybe I'll write my own rules for use for him within the Old World, and I'll share them on, like, my Patreon or something. That could be quite fun. I'll do a little video about it and you can catch the rules for him from there. But since he's begun making appearances in the Old World, in the Age of Sigmar, there's been all kinds of awesome short stories that have been published in the back of White Dwarf, where he's done things like helped a Slayer mother rescue her child from a Magmadroth, a Fire Slayer mother rescue her child from a Magmadroth, or turned up to defend a bar against a swarm of Nighthaunts. The suggestion being that he pops by that tavern once every, decade to sup a pint of ale. He's ridden in skyships alongside the Carcharodons, that's the space sharks, the Caradon Overlords, although Carcharodons would look pretty cool, sharks in the front of the blimps. And the background that has been published for him since is that Grungni himself reforged the White Dwarf from his memories and his legend from the world that was. He took literally the power of belief and the power of the story of the White Dwarf, his son, from the world that was, and reforged it into something new to defend the dwarvish people, the Dwarden, of the mortal realms. There has been an appearance of the White Dwarf in Warhammer Total War. He was originally released as downloadable content with a coupon that you could get from the pages of White Dwarf, and then a little while after that he was available just free downloadable content for Warhammer Total War, but he has his own unique army within Warhammer Total War in which he can be used. He's appeared in comic book form. He's appeared in any number of different pieces of art. One of my all-time favourites, I think, was from issue 400 of White Dwarf, where they pictured him engaged in battle with a Chaos Warrior who bore a startling resemblance to the Harry the Hammer miniature that was released to celebrate that issue at that time. The White Dwarf Grombrindal. He has an article in White Dwarf at the moment every month where you can ask him questions, something that's a kind of a nice hark back to perhaps the days of Fat Dwarf, when issues of the magazine would be published with commentary suggesting that the White Dwarf was weighing in on a particular issue. The White Dwarf has appeared on the Blood Bowl pitch alongside a miniature for his arch nemesis, the Black Gobbo, that was established shortly after issue 200 when the new plastic Night Goblin models were released. Incidentally, those are the Night Goblin models that are now being re-released, the big head Gobbos being re-released for Warhammer the Old World. But the Goblins took over White Dwarf for a month and scratched out his name from the front of the magazine, rebranding it as Black Gobbo, and thus the Black Gobbo was born, initially as a conversion model made out of the standard bearer from the back of the Goblin Wolf Rider chariot. But now, since then, he's got, as I say, his own miniature on the Blood Bowl pitch, so that the two of them can engage in their rivalry in whatever weird, fun world Blood Bowl takes place in. Phew, that's a lot to take on board. In terms of what could happen for the White Dwarf going forward, well, I can only hope that he goes from strength to strength after issue 500. I'm really hoping that we get to see more of him within the lore of Age of Sigmar. Perhaps not too much. I wouldn't want it to become all about him. I think it's quite nice that Age of Sigmar is its own thing. I am looking forward to trying him out on the tabletop again, because I haven't used him, I think, since they published the rules in issue 300. I think that was the last time I bought a White Dwarf model and used him on the tabletop. That's the little one here, tipping his helmet. But yes, the model, if you haven't seen it, here it is again in all its glory, and the artwork in particular is beautiful that they have prepared for the cover of White Dwarf issue 500. I really hope they make that available as an art print, because I'd love to have it on the wall up there behind me. But I hope you've enjoyed this brief whistle-stop tour through the history of the White Dwarf. If you have, please click the subscribe button, click the like button to do all the YouTubey things. And in the meantime, don't forget, you can catch me every week here and over on the Morehammer Podcast. So I will catch you there as well. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. And as ever, I will catch you next time. Bye for now.